She reached a point where even hope felt exhausting. Not because she didn't want to believe anymore, but because believing had started to hurt. Every time she allowed herself to imagine a future, reality seemed to step in and quietly remind her of everything that hadn't worked. So she stopped dreaming. Not suddenly, not dramatically. She simply grew tired of holding expectations that never stayed. There was a strange stillness in her life, the kind that settles in when nothing is falling apart anymore, but nothing is growing either. From the outside, it looked like stability. Inside, it felt like an ending. She moved through her days doing what needed to be done, answering messages, completing tasks, showing up where she was expected. Yet something essential inside her had gone silent, as if her inner voice had decided there was nothing left to say. She often wondered when she had crossed that invisible line between trying and giving up. There was no clear moment, no single failure she could point to. It was the accumulation of small disappointments, quiet losses, and unanswered prayers that slowly convinced her she had reached the final chapter of her story. She didn't feel dramatic about it. Just resigned. As if life had gently closed a door without asking. At night, she would sit alone with her thoughts, not crying, not angry, just empty. She replayed memories of who she used to be, the version of herself that believed things could change, that effort mattered, that timing would eventually make sense. That version felt like someone she once knew but no longer recognized. And in that distance, a quiet grief lived. She stopped asking for signs. Stopped waiting for breakthroughs. Stopped expecting life to surprise her in kind ways. It wasn't bitterness. It was self-protection. Hope had become something dangerous, something that raised expectations only to leave her feeling smaller afterward. So she learned to keep her heart guarded, measured, realistic. There were moments she caught herself thinking, maybe this is it. Not in despair, but in acceptance. Maybe this is the life she was meant to live. Maybe some people are here to watch doors open for others. Maybe her role was simply to endure, not to expand. Those thoughts didn't scream. They whispered. And somehow, that made them harder to fight. She didn't talk about this part of herself with anyone. People knew her as capable, strong, reliable. No one suspected that behind that steadiness lived a woman who felt quietly finished with dreaming. She carried her exhaustion with dignity, convincing herself that wanting less was a form of maturity. And yet, beneath all that stillness, something subtle remained. A presence she couldn't explain. Not hope exactly, but awareness. A faint sense that the silence she was living in wasn't empty, it was waiting. She didn't trust it enough to name it. But it lingered. She had no idea that this sense of ending was not a conclusion at all. It was a pause. A threshold. The space before something entirely new could enter. And although she believed her story was over, life had not reached that decision yet. Because sometimes, when everything feels closed, the next door doesn't open through effort or force. Sometimes, it opens through something much quieter. Something she was about to rediscover. There was a loneliness in her that did not come from being alone, but from feeling unseen by life itself. She could be surrounded by people and still feel like she was standing on the outside of her own existence, watching everything move forward without her. It was the kind of loneliness that settles quietly, the kind you learn to live with because you no longer expect it to leave. She feared that this numbness was permanent. That the absence of excitement, expectation, and desire was not a phase, but a final state. Some nights, she wondered if she had already lived the most meaningful part of her life without realizing it. The thought didn't terrify her. It saddened her. Deeply. Like mourning a future that would never arrive. She carried disappointment like a familiar weight. Not sharp enough to wound her anymore, but heavy enough to slow every step. She remembered how many times she had tried to restart, to believe again, to open herself to possibility, only to feel foolish afterward. Over time, discouragement taught her a dangerous lesson: stop expecting, and nothing can disappoint you. There were moments when she felt completely disconnected from purpose. She asked herself what she was moving toward, and the answer came back blank. She wasn't chasing anything anymore. She wasn't running away either. She was simply existing in between, suspended in a life that felt finished but not concluded. If you have ever felt this kind of quiet defeat, this place where nothing hurts sharply anymore but nothing excites you either, then you already understand her. And if her story feels familiar, if it mirrors something inside you, take a moment now and write one word in the comments: gratitude. Not because everything is perfect, but because naming it is often where transformation begins. She didn't know it then, but acknowledging her emptiness was already a shift. Admitting that something inside her was closed was the first step toward opening it again. Sometimes the soul doesn't need motivation, it needs honesty. And honesty, when spoken gently, becomes an invitation. If you feel drawn to stories like this, stories that don't rush healing, that don't force positivity, that honor the quiet moments of being human, then allow yourself to subscribe. Not as a promise of answers, but as permission to keep listening. Some messages arrive only when we're ready to hear them. And if someone came to your mind while listening to this, someone who feels tired of hoping, someone who believes their story might be over, share this with them. Not to change them, but to remind them they are not alone in this pause. Sometimes, the smallest act of sharing is how a closed heart feels seen again. She believed she had reached the end of her story. But life was still watching her. Still listening. Still waiting for one quiet shift that would change everything. And that shift was closer than she imagined. She remembered the moments that slowly taught her to stop believing. They were not dramatic failures, but subtle ones. Doors that never fully opened. Opportunities that almost happened. Conversations that promised more than they delivered. Each time, she adjusted her expectations just a little lower, telling herself she was being realistic, mature, grounded. But deep down, something fragile was being taught to stay quiet. There were days when she felt like she had missed the timing of her own life. As if everyone else had received a signal she somehow didn't hear. She watched others move forward, not with envy, but with confusion. She wondered what they knew that she didn't. What invisible rule they were following. Have you ever felt this too? She carried emotional wounds that no one ever noticed because she learned to hide them well. She learned to smile at the right moments, to say the right things, to show gratitude even when she felt hollow inside. People praised her strength, unaware that strength had become her way of surviving disappointment rather than overcoming it. Does this touch something inside you? There were memories she avoided revisiting because they reminded her of how much she once believed. Old plans written in notebooks. Dreams spoken out loud to people who didn't stay. Promises she made to herself that life never seemed to answer. She didn't feel angry about them anymore. Just tired. Like someone who has waited too long for a train that never arrived. She often questioned whether wanting more was selfish. Whether her longing meant she was ungrateful for what she already had. So she learned to silence her desires, convincing herself that acceptance was the same as peace. But acceptance without fulfillment has a quiet way of turning into resignation. Have you ever carried that confusion inside you? She remembered moments when she felt invisible even to herself. Days that blended into one another, where nothing truly stood out. She was present, but not alive. Moving, but not inspired. Breathing, but not connected. And sometimes she wondered if this was simply what adulthood was supposed to feel like. There were nights when she lay awake replaying old versions of herself in her mind. The one who believed timing would eventually make sense. The one who trusted that effort mattered. The one who felt aligned with life instead of tolerated by it. Losing that version of herself felt like losing a quiet companion she never thought she would miss so deeply. She questioned her worth in subtle ways. Not with harsh self-judgment, but with doubt disguised as logic. Maybe she wasn't meant for more. Maybe her role was smaller. Maybe fulfillment was something meant for other people, people who knew how to reach it. Have you ever asked yourself questions like that when no one was listening? She didn't feel dramatic about her sadness. It didn't come in waves or tears. It came as a flatness, a steady emotional gray that followed her everywhere. And because it didn't look like pain, she believed she had no right to complain about it. Yet even in that emotional stillness, something within her resisted fully closing. A subtle awareness that the absence she felt wasn't emptiness, it was space. Space that had not yet been filled. Space waiting for something different. She didn't know it then, but that space was about to be touched by something she had overlooked for a very long time. And if any of this feels familiar to you, if these words echo a quiet truth you've carried too, then you already know what it feels like to stand right before a shift, without realizing how close it really is. She had learned how to move forward without expecting anything to change. It became a quiet habit, almost a skill. Wake up, do what needed to be done, go to sleep, repeat. There was comfort in the routine, but also a hidden grief. Because somewhere along the way, she stopped asking herself what she wanted. It felt safer not to know. She remembered times when she had stood on the edge of something new, heart racing, intuition whispering, only to step back at the last moment. Not because she lacked courage, but because she lacked evidence. Life had taught her to wait for proof before believing. And when proof never came, she learned to stay where she was. Have you ever felt frozen like that, not by fear, but by uncertainty? There were moments when she blamed herself for not trying harder, for not pushing through, for not forcing life to respond. But deep down, she knew exhaustion had played a role. She had tried for so long that trying itself had become heavy. Hope, once effortless, now felt like something she had to carry uphill alone. She noticed how her language had changed over time. She stopped saying, when, and started saying, if. She stopped saying, I will, and started saying, maybe. These small shifts seemed harmless, but they slowly rewrote the way she saw her future. Possibility became conditional. Dreams became optional. And slowly, quietly, they faded into the background. Sometimes she wondered if she had mistaken gratitude for settling. She told herself she should be thankful for what she had, and she was. Truly. But gratitude, when used to silence longing, can turn into a cage. And her heart felt confined in ways she could not explain. Does this touch something inside you? She watched life present opportunities to others and tried to convince herself she didn't want the same things anymore. It wasn't bitterness. It was adaptation. She reshaped her desires to fit what felt attainable. But every time she did, something inside her resisted, like a truth that refused to be rewritten. There were quiet mornings when she felt a strange pressure in her chest, not pain, not anxiety, but something unresolved. As if a part of her was gently knocking, asking to be acknowledged. She would place her hand over her heart and breathe through it, telling herself everything was fine. But the feeling never fully left. She felt disconnected from meaning, not because life lacked meaning, but because she had stopped expecting it to reach her. She didn't feel chosen. She felt overlooked. And after a while, she learned to overlook herself too. Have you ever felt like that, as if life were happening just slightly out of your reach? She avoided thinking too far ahead. The future felt too abstract, too uncertain, too emotionally demanding. It was easier to focus on the present moment, to keep things small and manageable. But something inside her longed for expansion, even if she didn't know how to allow it. She didn't realize that this state of emotional containment was not permanent. It was not who she was. It was who she had become while waiting for something she thought would never arrive. And the very stillness she mistook for an ending was actually preparing her for a different way of seeing. Because sometimes the door doesn't open when we push. Sometimes it opens when we soften. She had become very good at minimizing her own expectations. It wasn't something she planned, it happened slowly, almost invisibly. Each time something didn't work out, she told herself it wasn't meant to be. Each time an answer didn't come, she convinced herself she hadn't really needed it. Over time, this became a form of protection. If she expected less, she would feel less pain. At least, that's what she believed. There were moments when she caught herself feeling guilty for wanting more. As if longing itself were a flaw. She questioned whether her desires were unreasonable, whether she was asking too much from life. So she learned to quiet them. She folded her dreams neatly away, telling herself that maturity meant acceptance, not expansion. Have you ever silenced your own wants just to keep the peace inside? She remembered how easily gratitude had once flowed from her heart, back when it felt natural and alive. Somewhere along the way, gratitude had turned into obligation. She said thank you because she thought she should, not because she felt deeply connected to what she had. And that difference mattered more than she realized. Gratitude spoken without presence felt empty, even to her own soul. She carried an unspoken sadness, not loud enough to draw attention, but steady enough to shape her days. It wasn't despair. It was the quiet grief of a life that felt smaller than it was meant to be. She wondered if anyone else lived with this feeling, doing everything right, yet feeling disconnected from something essential. Does this touch something inside you? She stopped noticing the beauty in ordinary moments. The way light moved across the room. The comfort of a familiar sound. The miracle of simply being alive. Her mind was always elsewhere, occupied with maintaining balance, avoiding disappointment, managing expectations. Presence felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. There were times she thought about giving up on wanting answers altogether. To stop asking questions. To stop waiting for meaning. To live life as it came, without interpretation. But even then, something inside her resisted. A quiet voice reminding her that she was meant for more than endurance. That she was meant for participation. She felt disconnected from the version of herself that once trusted life. That version felt naive now, almost embarrassing. Yet, on certain days, she missed her deeply. She missed believing without proof. She missed expecting good things without needing justification. Have you ever missed an old version of yourself like that? She didn't know how to return to that place. It felt too far away, too fragile to reach. So she stayed where she was, functioning, responsible, contained. But the containment began to feel tight, like a space that no longer fit her growth. What she couldn't see yet was that this quiet dissatisfaction was not a failure of gratitude. It was a signal. A sign that something inside her was ready to reopen. Ready to feel again. Ready to reconnect with life, not through effort or force, but through awareness. She was standing right at the edge of a realization she hadn't yet named. And that realization was about to change the way she understood gratitude forever. The shift did not arrive as a dramatic event. There was no announcement, no sudden miracle, no loud sign from the universe. It came quietly, almost unnoticed, woven into an ordinary moment that could have passed like any other. She was alone, sitting at her table, the day moving slowly around her, when she felt an unexpected stillness settle inside her. Not emptiness. Not numbness. Stillness, like a pause that carried intention. She found herself reflecting on the word gratitude in a way she never had before. Not as a duty. Not as something she recited out of habit. But as a state of presence. She realized that for a long time, she had been saying thank you while mentally standing elsewhere, already bracing for disappointment, already guarding herself from hope. Gratitude had been something she performed, not something she inhabited. That realization softened something in her chest. For the first time, she allowed herself to sit fully inside the moment she was living. Not the life she wished she had. Not the life she feared she was stuck with. Just this moment. This breath. This quiet space where nothing was being asked of her. She reached for a notebook she kept nearby, not intending to do anything meaningful with it. She simply opened it. And without overthinking, she began to write. Not goals. Not dreams. Just acknowledgements. Small, honest observations about what was still intact in her life. What had not broken. What had remained. As she wrote, something unexpected happened. The words did not feel forced. They felt grounding. Each sentence brought her closer to herself, as if she were returning from a long emotional distance. Gratitude stopped feeling like a reminder of what she lacked and started feeling like a recognition of what was quietly supporting her. She noticed her breathing slow. Her shoulders relaxed. Her mind softened its grip. The heaviness she had been carrying didn't disappear, but it loosened. And in that loosening, space appeared. Space for clarity. Space for presence. Space for something new to enter. She realized then that gratitude was not about convincing life to give her more. It was about allowing herself to fully meet what already existed. And in that meeting, something subtle shifted. Her energy changed, not outwardly, but inwardly. She felt aligned in a way she hadn't felt in years. This moment did not feel like an ending. It felt like a doorway. A quiet opening created not by effort, but by awareness. Not by asking, but by acknowledging. She understood that she had not reached the end of her story. She had simply reached the point where force no longer worked. And for the first time in a long while, she sensed that life was responding, not to her striving, but to her presence. The days that followed did not change on the outside, but inside her, something had begun to reorganize itself. She returned to that notebook every morning, not with expectation, but with intention. She didn't write to ask for anything. She wrote to notice. Simple moments. Small continuities. Quiet forms of support she had overlooked for years. She began each page the same way, slowly, deliberately, allowing herself to be present with every word. Gratitude stopped being a list and became a state. She noticed how the act of writing softened her thoughts, how her breathing followed the rhythm of the pen. There was no urgency in it. No pressure to transform. Just awareness settling into place. As the days passed, her writing grew deeper. She acknowledged the resilience that had carried her through exhaustion. The stability that had remained when everything else felt uncertain. The quiet strength that had kept her moving even when she believed her story was finished. These acknowledgments didn't inflate her emotions. They grounded them. She realized that gratitude was not about denying what was missing. It was about recognizing what was holding her together. And in that recognition, something steady emerged. A sense of internal safety. A feeling that life, even in its silence, had not been against her. She began pairing her writing with small rituals. A pause before starting her day. A moment of stillness before sleep. Sometimes she placed her hand over her heart, not to ask for answers, but to acknowledge her own presence. These moments were brief, but they carried weight. One evening, as she wrote, a sentence surfaced without effort, as if it had been waiting to be remembered. Gratitude is the miracle that keeps the universe in motion. She read it slowly, letting it settle. It didn't feel like a quote. It felt like truth returning to its place. She noticed how this shift affected her inner dialogue. The constant evaluation softened. The need to measure progress faded. She wasn't trying to get anywhere anymore. She was allowing herself to arrive where she already was. And strangely, that made everything feel lighter. Over time, the notebook became something more than a place to write. It became a container for presence. A space where she could meet herself without judgment. She began to think of it as her manifestation journal, not because she was trying to create outcomes, but because she was aligning with awareness. She didn't tell anyone about this practice. It felt too personal, too subtle to explain. She simply lived it. And in living it, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: internal coherence. Her thoughts, emotions, and energy no longer pulled in opposite directions. Nothing dramatic had happened yet. No doors had visibly opened. But inside her, something had settled into alignment. And without realizing it, she had created the conditions for change, not through effort, but through gratitude. The changes began quietly, almost shyly, as if life didn't want to startle her. They arrived in small moments that felt ordinary on the surface, yet carried a strange sense of rightness beneath them. A calm morning where her thoughts didn't rush ahead of her. An unexpected sense of ease while doing things that once felt heavy. Nothing dramatic, but unmistakably different. She noticed that her body responded before her mind did. Her shoulders stayed relaxed longer. Her breath felt deeper. The tension she had carried without noticing began to release in subtle waves. It was as if her nervous system had received a message that it was finally safe to soften. Her days started to feel less resistant. Tasks unfolded with less friction. Conversations flowed more naturally. Even silence felt kinder. She wasn't forcing positivity or looking for proof. She was simply present, and presence seemed to invite gentleness into everything it touched. There were moments when clarity arrived without effort. Not answers to big questions, but small understandings that settled her from the inside. She found herself making decisions more easily, trusting her own sense of timing instead of second-guessing every choice. The constant mental noise had quieted enough for intuition to be heard. She continued writing in her manifestation journal, not chasing outcomes, but anchoring awareness. And she noticed something unexpected: what she wrote began to echo back through her days. The gratitude she expressed internally seemed to shape the way life met her externally. Not through coincidence, but through alignment. Her perception shifted. She began noticing what was working instead of what was missing. She felt supported in ways she hadn't recognized before. Small openings appeared where she once saw only walls. Not because the walls had disappeared, but because she was no longer pushing against them. There was a morning when she paused mid-step, overcome by a quiet realization. Life had not suddenly become perfect. But it felt responsive. As if it was listening again. As if something had turned back on. She understood then that gratitude had not solved her life. It had softened her resistance to it. And in that softening, space had opened. Space for movement. Space for response. Space for something new to enter. If this moment of awareness resonates with you, you're invited to write, "I receive," in the comments. No explanation. No expectation. Just acknowledgement. She didn't yet know where this shift would lead. But she knew one thing with certainty: life was no longer closed to her. And that quiet knowing carried more power than any dramatic sign ever could. The shift moved from subtle to tangible without announcing itself. One day, she noticed that something she had been postponing for months no longer felt heavy. She handled it calmly, without resistance, without the familiar tightening in her chest. The ease surprised her. It wasn't motivation that moved her forward. It was clarity. Small changes began stacking quietly. A conversation that once would have drained her now felt neutral, even supportive. A situation that used to trigger anxiety passed without leaving a mark. She realized she was responding differently to life, and life, in turn, was responding differently to her. An opportunity appeared where she hadn't been looking. Not sudden or overwhelming, but aligned. It felt natural, almost obvious, as if it had been waiting for her internal state to catch up. She didn't rush toward it. She didn't hesitate either. She simply recognized it and stepped forward. Her emotional landscape continued to stabilize. The sharp edges softened. The constant background tension faded. She felt grounded in her own presence, less reactive, more centered. Decisions became simpler because they were no longer driven by fear of loss or hunger for validation. She returned to her manifestation journal and noticed how the tone of her writing had changed. There was less longing and more recognition. Less effort and more trust. What she once wrote as wishes now appeared as acknowledgments in progress. The journal no longer felt like a request to life, but a dialogue with it. She began trusting her timing. When something felt misaligned, she waited without anxiety. When something felt right, she acted without overthinking. This balance brought a sense of internal authority she hadn't felt before. She wasn't asking life for permission anymore. Support arrived in simple, grounded ways. Guidance through conversation. Insight through quiet reflection. Confirmation through experiences that felt steady rather than overwhelming. It wasn't excitement that confirmed she was on the right path. It was calm. She realized that what was changing wasn't just circumstance. It was her relationship with reality itself. She no longer felt at odds with life. She felt in dialogue with it. And that changed everything. Her story had not restarted dramatically. It had resumed naturally, as if it had only been paused. And now, with resistance released, it was moving again, quietly, steadily, forward. As the days unfolded, she noticed a widening inside her that had nothing to do with circumstances and everything to do with perception. Life felt less narrow. Less constrained. She no longer moved through it bracing for disappointment. She moved through it listening. And that alone changed the quality of everything. She began to sense direction without forcing it. Ideas surfaced at the right moment. Thoughts arrived fully formed, calm, clear. There was no rush to act on them, only a quiet recognition that they belonged to her. For the first time in a long while, she trusted herself enough to let clarity lead instead of urgency. Her inner voice grew steadier. It didn't push. It didn't warn. It guided. When doubt appeared, it no longer took over. It passed through like a cloud, no longer convincing her that it defined the sky. She had learned how to return to presence, and presence became her ground. She felt an unfamiliar sense of dignity within herself. Not pride. Not confidence in the loud sense. A quiet knowing that her life was valid, meaningful, and unfolding in its own timing. She no longer needed proof to feel aligned. Alignment had become internal. She noticed how gratitude had rewired her attention. She no longer searched for what was missing. She noticed what was forming. She felt connected to her days again, not as a spectator, but as a participant. Life didn't feel like something to endure anymore. It felt like something to meet. Her manifestation journal reflected this awakening. The entries became simpler, more intentional. She wrote from a place of coherence rather than longing. Each page grounded her further into the present moment, reinforcing a sense of stability she had once believed impossible. There was a morning when she paused mid-thought and felt a sentence rise naturally within her. Today, I choose to believe. It didn't feel like an affirmation. It felt like a decision that had already been made. Belief no longer meant hoping something would change. It meant trusting what was already unfolding. She felt aligned with timing instead of fighting it. She felt supported by life rather than overlooked by it. Her energy shifted in ways others could sense. Conversations changed. Interactions softened. She wasn't trying to be different. She simply was. And that presence carried a quiet gravity. She understood then that awakening didn't arrive as revelation. It arrived as remembrance. A return to trust. A return to alignment. A return to self. The more she allowed herself to remain present, the more life seemed to respond with steadiness rather than intensity. There was no rush, no dramatic surge forward. Instead, there was continuity. A sense that things were finally moving in the same direction instead of pulling against each other. She felt supported in a way that did not demand proof. Her days began to carry a quiet rhythm that felt sustainable. She no longer burned energy trying to anticipate outcomes or protect herself from disappointment. She trusted the pace. She trusted the unfolding. This trust did not make her passive, it made her grounded. She acted when action felt natural, and rested when stillness felt necessary. She noticed that her reactions had changed. Situations that once would have unsettled her now passed without disturbing her inner balance. She didn't need to analyze why. She simply recognized that something within her had stabilized. The emotional swings softened. The urgency dissolved. Her sense of worth no longer depended on progress being visible. She felt whole even when nothing extraordinary happened. This was new. She had spent so long measuring herself through effort, through results, through survival. Now, her sense of value existed independently of outcome. She continued returning to her manifestation journal, not as a tool for control, but as a space for alignment. The words she wrote felt intentional, grounded, rooted in awareness. She no longer wrote to become someone else. She wrote to stay connected to who she already was. There was a moment when she realized that her gratitude had shifted completely. It was no longer directed at circumstances. It was directed at existence itself. At the fact that she was still here. Still capable of perceiving, of adjusting, of choosing presence over resistance. She felt awake in a way that did not demand excitement. Awake meant attentive. Awake meant receptive. Awake meant trusting the moment without trying to shape it prematurely. She had stopped asking life to prove itself. The phrase returned to her again, not as repetition, but as confirmation. Today, I choose to believe. Belief was no longer an effort. It was a stance. She sensed that this inner expansion was not temporary. It was structural. A shift in how she related to herself and to life. Something fundamental had realigned, and there was no need to announce it. She understood now that her story had never ended. It had simply been waiting for her to meet it differently. What followed did not feel like a sudden reward, but like a natural response. As if life had been waiting for her to stop resisting it in order to move closer. Opportunities began to appear in ways that felt steady and grounded, not overwhelming. She found herself in the right place at the right time without trying to orchestrate anything. Conversations opened doors. Small decisions led to meaningful shifts. Nothing felt forced, and that was how she knew it was real. Her inner state continued to shape her outer experience. Because she was no longer desperate for change, change arrived calmly. Because she was no longer chasing validation, recognition came without demand. She noticed that when she acted from gratitude rather than urgency, outcomes aligned more naturally. Life felt cooperative instead of confrontational. She no longer felt like she had to prove herself to deserve movement. Her manifestation journal remained close, not as a strategy, but as a witness. She wrote from a place of acknowledgement, documenting the quiet expansions as they happened. What once would have felt insignificant now felt meaningful. Each page reflected a woman who was no longer waiting for permission to live fully. She was already living in alignment with herself, and the world was responding accordingly. Emotionally, she felt abundant in a way she had never experienced before. Not overwhelmed with happiness, but rooted in contentment. There was space inside her now. Space to receive. Space to respond. Space to expand without fear. She noticed how her thoughts had softened, how her expectations had become grounded rather than defensive. She trusted her capacity to meet whatever came next. Professionally and personally, things began to reorganize themselves around this new internal stability. She didn't push for outcomes, yet progress was undeniable. She felt seen in spaces where she had once felt overlooked. She felt supported in ways that felt genuine rather than conditional. Her life was no longer shrinking to avoid disappointment. It was expanding because she was present enough to allow it. She understood then that gratitude had not opened a door by accident. It had aligned her with the part of life that responds to awareness rather than effort. The door that opened was not external at first. It was internal. And once that door opened, everything else followed naturally. This expansion did not feel like arrival. It felt like permission. Permission to continue. Permission to trust. Permission to let life meet her where she was instead of where she thought she should be. And she knew, without needing reassurance, that this was not the peak. It was a foundation. From that foundation, her life began to grow in ways that felt both unexpected and deeply familiar, as if she were finally stepping into a rhythm that had always belonged to her. She no longer felt surprised when good things unfolded, she felt prepared. Gratitude had adjusted her posture toward life, and now she met opportunities with steadiness instead of disbelief. What arrived no longer startled her nervous system. It fit. Her days carried a sense of quiet abundance. Not excess, not spectacle, but sufficiency layered with meaning. She noticed how decisions became clearer because they were no longer driven by fear of loss. She chose based on alignment, and alignment responded. The effort she once believed was necessary was replaced by presence, and presence proved far more powerful. The manifestation journal continued to hold her process, but its role shifted again. It was no longer a place where she tracked change. It was a place where she anchored identity. She wrote from the perspective of someone who trusted her life. Someone who recognized patterns forming in her favor without needing to control them. Each entry reinforced a sense of coherence between who she was internally and what she was experiencing externally. Her emotional landscape stabilized even further. She didn't oscillate between hope and disappointment anymore. She remained centered. Challenges still appeared, but they did not shake her sense of direction. She met them as part of movement rather than evidence of failure. Life no longer felt personal in its resistance. It felt instructional, responsive, alive. Connections around her shifted naturally. Some dynamics softened. Others faded. New relationships formed with ease, grounded in mutual presence rather than emotional urgency. She felt supported not because she demanded it, but because she was no longer blocking it. Her openness invited resonance. She recognized that the door gratitude had opened was not tied to a single outcome. It was a doorway into participation. Into trust. Into a way of living that allowed growth without strain. She was no longer waiting for life to confirm her worth. She was living from it. This expansion did not feel like a miracle in the dramatic sense. It felt inevitable. Like something that had been delayed only until she was ready to receive it without fear. And now that it had begun, it carried a momentum that did not require force to sustain. Her story had not restarted. It had continued from a deeper place. And she moved forward knowing that whatever unfolded next would meet her where she stood, present, aligned, and no longer closed. As her life settled into this new rhythm, something shifted in the way the world met her. Without effort, without announcement, she began to be noticed. Not in a loud or overwhelming way, but with a kind of recognition that felt calm and sincere. People listened more closely when she spoke. Her presence carried weight, not because she demanded attention, but because she no longer doubted her place. Opportunities for visibility appeared naturally. Invitations arrived that felt aligned rather than intimidating. Conversations turned into connections. Her voice, once careful and restrained, now moved with clarity and steadiness. She shared parts of her journey without needing to explain or justify them. And in doing so, she noticed something unexpected: others recognized themselves in her story. She did not seek admiration, yet respect followed. Not because she had achieved something extraordinary, but because she embodied coherence. There was a groundedness in her that people trusted. A quiet authority that came from living in alignment rather than proving worth. Her gratitude was no longer internal only, it shaped the way she interacted with the world. She saw how her story, once lived in silence, now carried meaning beyond her own life. The struggles she had endured became context rather than burden. The pause she once feared became wisdom. And the door that gratitude had opened inside her now allowed others to feel less alone in their own waiting. If this story resonates with you, you're welcome to leave a word in the comments that reflects where you are right now. And if this kind of narrative speaks to you, you're invited to subscribe, gently, without pressure, allowing these stories to continue finding you when they're meant to. Her recognition did not feel like arrival. It felt like reflection. Life was simply mirroring back the openness she had finally allowed herself to live from. Looking back, she understood that nothing had been missing from her life. Nothing had been delayed by mistake. Everything had been preparing her for the moment she would stop bracing and start receiving. The belief that her story was over had not been a failure of faith, it had been a signal that force was no longer the way forward. Gratitude did not change her life overnight. It changed her relationship with it. And that change reshaped everything. She no longer waited for doors to open. She noticed when they were already unlocked. She no longer asked life to prove itself. She met it with presence. Her manifestation journal remained with her, not as a tool for outcomes, but as a reminder of alignment. A record of the moment she chose awareness over resistance. Trust over urgency. Participation over withdrawal. It marked the point where her life resumed, not louder, but truer. She carried a quiet certainty now. Not about what would happen next, but about her capacity to meet it. She knew that whatever unfolded would no longer require her to abandon herself in the process. That knowledge grounded her more deeply than any external success ever could. The door that opened through gratitude did not lead to a single answer. It led to a way of living. A way of moving forward without fear of silence. A way of trusting that life responds not to effort alone, but to presence. If this story touched something inside you, you're invited to comment a word that reflects what you're ready to receive. You're welcome to subscribe, allowing these narratives to continue accompanying your path. And if someone you care about is standing in a pause of their own, sharing this may be a quiet way of letting them know their story is still unfolding. Because no story ends when awareness begins. And sometimes, the door we've been waiting for opens not through effort, but through gratitude.